Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Australian China Institute for Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of this institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we are all sitting on today at various locations. In particular, the Darug people of the Darug Nation, where the institute is located at our Parramatta South campus, and pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you for attending this seminar, which is going to be interesting, informative, and thought-provoking. Web novels, creativity and technology, an odd but also inevitable partnership in the digital age. Web novels emerged as a disruptive model for literary publishing in the late 1990s. Since then, web novels have been industrialized and internationalized. Web novels in Asian languages in particular have seen a sharp increase in dissemination and distribution across multiple platforms. Our research fellow, Dr. Tony Ren, has a specialty in digital publishing, cultural globalization, and Chinese creative industries. Today, Dr. Ren will share his research on web novels and emerging trends in online creative writing. At the end of Dr. Ren's presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So you are welcome to post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will collect them for Dr. Ren to answer. Now, please welcome Dr. Tony Ren. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jing, for the kind introduction. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. It's great to have this opportunity to share my research on digital publishing and web novels. Web novels are actually a very interesting emerging field of online writing, social reading, and transmedia storytelling. People who are not very familiar with the field would probably regard it as simply self-publishing or fan fiction or amateur writing. But actually, the practices of web novels are much more dynamic, innovative, and also influential. In many countries, as Jing just introduced, web novels have been highly industrialized and has reached a vast scale. Many popular web novels are even more commercially successful than traditional bestsellers. And more importantly, in my view, the value of web novels is related to population-wide creativity, the public cultural participation in writing, reading, and literature. And thus, web novels are very valuable in terms of cultural diversity and inclusiveness, particularly when we think about millions of people are able to share their stories, tell their stories online in the community-based web novel sites. And more recently, the globalization of web novels and the wide dissemination of translated Asian and Chinese web novels in the English-speaking world. So all these are very dynamic changes and trends. And I'm going to talk more about these new developments and innovations in today's seminar. I hope you will enjoy the talk. Now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I hope you can see the slides. Okay, so this talk is about my recent project. In this project, I'm looking at the global communication of translated Asian web novels. And in this project, I also use both big data analysis of about 4,000 web novel titles, as well as critical research to study the content, reading, and the influences of web novels in a global literary system. So here is the outline of today's talk. I will start with an overview of the web novel developments globally and also in China. And then I will briefly touch on the main arguments in the industry and academic discourses about web novels. In the second part, I'm going to present some of the research findings, some data-driven analysis about the features and the trends of web novel storytelling, and as well as the reading and the fandom and the communication of web novels globally. And I will have some brief discussion on the new trends of globalized web novel storytelling and digital publishing, and what it means for the global China or global Asia cultural interactions in a digital age. So I will start with what are web novels? It's actually a very big question, also very hard to answer. Web novels have other names, if you like. Someone call it online literature, or web fiction, or web series. But generally speaking, web novels are born digital, serialized, user-generated stories. Mostly genre stories, like fantasy, romance, science fiction, crime, and many other genres. The practices of web novels actually vary widely from country to country. And the overall, the web novel field is also very fast-pacing and innovative. So in this slide, I just show you two very popular web novel websites and their very latest novel titles. So give you a bit of sense about what these novel stories are about. If we look at the academic and industry discourses on web novels, actually there are many ways you can understand or theorize web novels, but I would put it as a disruption. If you look at the communication model of web novels, they allow readers, writers, and the content to directly interact with each other without the intermediation of publishers. So this is a very big change if you are familiar with traditional publishing, because publishers' gatekeeping is everything about the traditional publishing value chain. And this is also a big fear of publishers facing digital revolution. Here I quote an article which is very widespread in 2012 when Kindle was on the rise and the global publishers were in great fear. And that article titled "eBooks, the Giant Disruption." It summarizes publishers' worries about the new models of publishing would disintermediate the publishing value chain and undermine publishers' role as gatekeepers, distributors, and taste makers. But this fearful prediction hasn't become reality in the publishing world, because as we know, many legacy publishers still exist today. But in some emerging fields, like popular literature, like web novels, like online writing, the new models have changed the practices, the model, and the power structure very profoundly. Here I quote two other articles, which actually are about two very popular web novel platforms, Wattpad in North America and Qidian in China. And they were talking about, are these models the future of publishing? I think there are many changes web novels or the new models have brought into the publishing field. But one thing is that they have empowered individual writers more than ever before in the publishing world. And thus the content creators have more control in the whole literary communication. And also readers are more active, connected, and participatory in the digital publishing world. We know that in genre fiction, there's a long history of fandom or fan culture, but digital publishing and web novels have more active user co-creation and fandom in the web novel communication, as I will show you later. As a result of this disruptive publishing practices, we can see some noticeable changes in the content of web novels. For example, one thing I would like to highlight here is the diversity of web novel stories. So here is some report on Wattpad about the culturally diverse genre stories published in Wattpad. So the recent years have seen massive increase of such culturally diverse stories featuring a diverse characters. And more importantly, the more reading time spent on such diverse stories. They have a hashtag called POC, protagonists of color. If you are familiar with traditional publishing, probably you are aware that there are many studies about how the culturally diverse groups are underrepresented in the print literature publishing system. And that is actually some kind of change in the new publishing system. And another change I want to draw your attention is the translation. So here is the data I extracted from WebNovel sites in my project. You can see the availability of translations of Asian web novels in English platforms. So there are about a total of 8,000 to 7,000 to 8,000 titles, and translated from a variety of Asian languages. So it's also very different from print literature publishing. So I know there is a widely accepted 3% rule in the literature publishing in the English countries. So generally in the biggest markets like the United States, like the UK, only 3% of the total books are translations. And it is changing, this is growing, but still very small percentage. But the new models like web novels provide more opportunities actually for the dissemination of translations of Asian stories or Chinese web novel stories. You could debate on the quality, but still it provides new opportunities and dynamics. So here are some kind of translated web novels. They are originally published in Asia and in Asian languages, but have been translated and disseminated globally in English. And this talk, my research is actually based on the big data analysis of such titles. Now let's move from global to China, because the web novel stories we are looking at are originally created in the Chinese web novel industry and later translated into English. And I will briefly introduce the context of the Chinese web novel industry. The Chinese web novel started to boom in late 1990s, and after that have been growing and evolving very rapidly. The industry today has a huge scale, I would say. If you have a look at the statistics, you might be impressed. So there are millions of people writing online, and also millions of web novel stories are available. So that is a huge system of digital publishing, writing, and reading. It's also very complex. It's different from many other countries. But I'm not going to give you a very in-depth analysis of the Chinese web novel industry. Instead, I would like to show you 3 photos, which I think are the very good snapshots of the Chinese web novel system to give you a bit sense about the whole environment there. So firstly, it's the group of young people who have founded the largest web novel website in China called Qidian. So these young people are, they were university students when they started the website in 2002. And they were all fantasy lovers. And they like fantasy, they wanna create something for the community. So it actually shows the very strong grassroots base of web novel. It is grassroots creativity in China. And the second photo, the Chinese people probably could recognize the gentleman here was Mo Yan, the Chinese Nobel laureate in literature. And he was invited to attend the opening ceremony of Online Literature University, which is a quite interesting institute where the traditional writers were invited to train online writers on how to write. And it is not free of controversy. As a very popular web novelist commented, how could they teach us how to write web novels? Very few people read their works, and we have millions of followers. So it's a kind of a joke, but actually it reflects a very complex relationship between web novels as an emerging popular writing system and the traditional Chinese literary system based on literary novels and also the literary elites, if you like. So there are collaboration, of course, and there are integration as well, but the difference is still very obvious. The third photo is about it's a very recent one. Again, if you can read in Chinese, you could probably find that the wording is very interesting here. It is a ceremony called the top 10 most influential intellectual properties of the year. So it's not about individual novels. It's not about authors like normal literary awards. It listed the most influential intellectual properties. So which is about a business model. And it's not just wording. It actually reflects a very big change in the literature business models in China, moving from individual titles or stories to the IP franchising, transmedia adaptation, and IP operation. So that has built a very big system to make money, to make revenues from popular content. So that is why I said many popular web novels are even more commercially successful than traditional bestsellers or best-selling titles. So I give you a further example, which is a Chinese web novel that is very popular. It was published about 10 years ago as a web novel here. And then it has been adapted into comics, film, game, animation, and also printed in, published as print book and mobile phone reading app. So you can see this is a transmedia storytelling system for the popular web novels. That is how they use intellectual property exploitation and operation to monetize popular content. And interestingly, all these have been translated by professionals or by fans into English and disseminated globally. So you have English versions of the novel, of course, and also with English subtitles of the games, animations, and the comics. So that's the way how the Chinese web novels or Asian web novels are going global with transmedia storytelling and cross-cultural or cross-media practices. So that's something probably very new in the digital publishing system. So now let's briefly have a look at the discourses around the global expansion of Chinese web novels. So actually the practices of the global expansion of Chinese or Asian web novels started around 2010, and initially by fans, the fan translation, and later the corporation and the publishing companies joined the industry. So it has been really moving very quickly. And now a large number of web novels are available across the globe. I will show you some visualization of big data later about the distribution. But here I want to draw your attention to the discourses in China around web novels, global expansion and communication. So it's interesting that the official media or the government officials tend to regard web novels as a new carrier of cultural soft power and the culture going out, and also a new symbol of Chinese culture. So this is, in my view, debatable. I'm going to revisit the discourses after the recent finding. But at this stage, I would say that it raises a very interesting question about what is the role of web novels or the distributed digital and participatory cultural practices in the cultural exchanges and the literary exchanges, and how can it contribute to the mutual understanding and the cultural developments. So that's something I think would be very interesting to discuss. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the research project I have recently conducted. So it's a big data analysis of the English translations of Asian web novels. And in the project, I have extracted data from different web novel websites. So as you can see here, this is a typical web page, and you have lots of information to collect or to extract, including the metadata of the books, the titles, the synopses, and also the genre tags here. So it's very interesting and very useful to analyze what kind of stories are being told. And you can also extract reader and reading data, the reading metrics. So the total views, for example, the total reviews, and also the virtual gifts the readers send to the authors. So that is a whole system of information and data you could collect to analyze what kind of stories are told and how they are told and read. So that is some background about the research project. So now I'm going to show you some of the findings here. Firstly, it's about the genre tags. So as you probably, I'll show you. So the genre tags, they're used here to define a story. So some of them were provided by the platform, and some were created by the writers, translators, or fans. So collectively, they are used to define what kind of stories are being told in the web novel sites. So here are the most popular, most frequently used genre tags of web novels in two popular sites. So as you can see there, you are some kind of very popular global genre fiction genres like action, adventure, romance, fantasy, of course, and also some kind of very interesting user-generated genre tags like male protagonist here, and weak to strong, and cultivation, kind of very personalized storytelling tags to describe what kind of stories actually are used. And I also hope to draw your attention to a couple of very interesting genre tags. For example, here, yoi and josei here. So they are actually very popular Japanese genres in Japanese graphic novels. And also they appear as very popular tags to define the Chinese web novels. That actually show us very interesting cultural hybridity in the web novel storytelling. It's not just about Chinese culture, it's about broadly the Asian popular culture integrated into the web novel storytelling field. And also, if you pay attention to the tags here, there are very limited number of tags related to China or Chinese culture. You probably could find martial arts here or somewhere. So it's actually a very limited number. You can find Eastern fantasy is probably another very Chinese or Asian genre tag. So that's also reflect a kind of transcultural or globalized storytelling system as web novel is presented. So here are the kind of detailed number of how many titles are in the popular genres. I just listed here. And also, I'm using the titles, all the titles of the web novels to do some frequently used words analysis or visualization. So I group all the web novels according to different genres or genre tags. And for the largest group would be one is fantasy and another is romance. So we put all the fantasy novels together and look at what are the popular words the author or the translator use in the titles to tell the story, to attract readers, and so on and so forth. So then it's very interesting. You can find very clear genre elements and a very big difference between different genres. So here, one word cloud is for fantasy and one is for romance. So I think I don't need to tell you which one is for what. Okay, there is a very clear difference. So look at the words they use. And if you compare with literary publishing or the traditional publishing, probably you can find that it's actually very concentrated. So for example, in romance, my data mining suggests that 17% of the titles use the word wife in the title. And similarly, in the fantasy web novels, the writers tend to use words like gods, heaven, emperor, world, immortal. So in romance, you can see a wife, loving, marriage, husband, sweet, etc. So that actually show really strong and obvious genre elements in the web novel storytelling. And again, if you want to find some Chinese or China-related cultural elements, it's not that obvious. So martial here, of course, you can see it's martial arts, and dragon probably another. And so you can't find other kind of Confucius or even China or Chinese or Beijing, Shanghai, Great Wall, etc. So that is also something identified by the data mining. That's very interesting to understand the storytelling of web novels. Another analysis is about the synopses or the book description. So in each web novel, there is one or two paragraphs used for introducing the story and also listing the key selling points and so on and so forth. That's a very useful interface for the readers to know very quickly what the story is about. So if you put all these 4,000 short paragraphs of description and introductions into a data set, and which is about 400,000 words totally. And you do some kind of data mining or text mining. Here, I just show you a very straightforward analysis, which is the most frequently used terms. So which is means that they are more than one words. So the terms, what are the most frequently used terms in the description of the stories? And you can find that there are some general storytelling terms. For example, one day. So that's appear very frequently. And also young man. That actually probably suggests that the readers and the writers are mostly the younger generation of people. There is an identity issue here. And the martial arts, again, it's a very popular element. Also, there are some clusters identified by text mining. One cluster would be about world. So you can see there are many words here. So new world and modern world, entire world. And also if you see list, there are also kind of cultivation world, real world, etc. So that is one interesting cluster. And another one would be life. So new life, past life, previous life, and also something like a real life, entire life. So that actually could probably suggest some very consistent storytelling or storylines in the web novel stories. And if we think about genre fiction generally, it is argued that the genre fiction provides a kind of escape from the real world or real life. And that storylines, as identified through data mining or text mining, probably suggests similar trends or similar storytelling features in the web novels. So here are just some kind of very straightforward and very easy to explain text mining to show you some very key features or some kind of interesting trend of storytelling. Now let's move to the consumption side. Where are the readers of Chinese translated web novels? Here is the data visualization of about 20,000 valid user location information. So it's not the whole picture, but it makes some sense about where are the readers. So you can see there's one big area in Southeast Asia and India, also America, and Africa, of course, have a lot of readers. And almost everywhere, I don't know whether you can see it clearly, they are actually, the readers are across the globe for the translated web novels. And also, you can use the data analysis to identify the key features of reading of web novels. So how the web novels are being read by the readers. What I want to highlight here is that it's not just about reading or how many readers you have. Of course, you can get this information very easily. This is all the titles I extracted from 2 websites. You can see how many are very popular and how many actually have a very limited readership. But also, that visualization shows how many reviews or readers' comments each title have received. So you can see generally, the more readers you have, the more user reviews or user interactions you will have for the title, for individual titles. That actually reflects the interactive nature or the social reading of web novels in the web novel platforms. And again, the majority of web novels have very limited popularity, readership, of interactions, and some are super best-selling. So with actually millions of readers. Okay, so now I'm just very quickly wrap up the talk by making 3 points. So one is actually, I think web novels as a translated literature in the digital system shows some very different features compared with traditional literature translation. So I think there are a kind of very interesting cultural hybridity between the global genre fiction or genre storytelling and the Chinese local cultural and social elements. So that actually raises an important issue about the nexus of the global, the national, and the local elements, and how these cultural elements are being integrated in the web novel storytelling, and how the negotiation or the competition or the conflicts of these cultural elements are being represented in the web novel storytelling. So that actually needs more interpretive and critical analysis further to the big data text mining analysis. And another point is about the consumption side, the FAN-INTERMEDIATION and the transcultural fandom. So I think the web novels actually suggest a very active readership and participatory reading or social reading. In that context, fans actually function as a kind of intermediaries, and also the creator, transcreators or translators, and taste makers and gatekeepers. So this is a very dynamic field of global literary communication or literary exchange. So it's not really as formal, as official as the established one, but definitely has introduced some very interesting and important dynamics that was further exploring. And the last point I want to make is about the discourses I showed you earlier. So what is the role of the emerging cultural practices like web novels and the globalized fan participation or interactive reading and writing? What is the role of such practices in the cultural and literary exchanges between China and the global other countries, and between Asia, China, and the global communities? So I think that is actually also something emerged in the web novel studies and web novel practices. I mean, this is an open question. I think we still need kind of new research, also new approach to understand the dynamics and the influence. But one thing probably is clear is that we probably should move slightly beyond the nation-state focus when studying China's cultural exchange and the cultural, global cultural expansion, and to look at the transcultural and the transcultural sphere, and look at some kind of very interesting cultural hybridity, rather than just talking about China versus non-China or Chinese versus the West. So in short, we need a kind of new approach to studying the transcultural dynamics and influences. So I think I will stop here, and I'm glad to take some questions and discussion. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. I mean, it's fascinating. I found it really, really interesting. And even though Tony and I, we work together, but we seldom get into each other's research area. So we have a lot of other things to talk about. So it's really interesting to, to hear what he's been saying. And literature has always been my passion. So I can see lots of things that I'm interested in. And I found these concepts of interactive writing. It's really interesting, and who decides the plot, you know, so it's not just the writer or author himself, and it's not singular person anymore. It's like a group, as you mentioned. I mean, even those concepts, the terms that you use, collectively decide, you know? So it's a very versus a traditional writer in solitude. And also, response, like response to story, to plot, is very way before the book is finished. And that's also very unlike, you know, traditional writing. And you don't know, you know, when you write the book, you don't even think of the audiences or how they are going to react. Now you even have taste makers, you know, how these people feel the taste and they like it or not. I think they take, to me, it's like they take a lot of elements from filmmaking, you know, film or TV drama series these days, they do a lot of a taste type of a trial, and, you know, so they are closer. So I have I can see a few questions, but I have a few questions as well. So I'll ask this question first. Why do you think this web novel or the online writing is more popular in China than in Australia?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, because the practice is actually very widely from country to country. And in my view, it is largely because of the development of the established publishing system. So if you compare with, you know, the publishing industry, the print publishing industry in China and in Australia, when web novels were emerged or on the rise in the late 1990s, the Chinese print publishing sector was not that modernized or established or very capable of publishing genre fiction and popular literature particularly. Well, in the West, for example, in Australia, in the United States or the UK, they have very established digital print publishing or traditional publishing sector. So very established value chain or the food chain. So it is being disrupted in some ways, but still have the legacy, the whole system. So that is probably the reason, a reason that if you think about a competition between the emerging and the established system, in China, definitely the traditional publishing sector is not very competitive when they face the digital disruption and the revolution. Another possible factor is the different understandings. So as I started by saying that web novels, some regard web novels as self-publishing or fan fiction. These are the concepts mostly in the Western context. So they have some kind of preoccupied ideas that this digital writing might not be as high quality as, you know, the print. Well, in China, it is very much a very open system when the digital age has arrived. And people are actually more open-minded because in the printer system, they didn't read a lot of interesting genre stories. And then there are many stories available online, so they are more open-minded to read more about that. So it's different kind of factors, and it's quite, you know, depending on the contexts.
Just a bit follow on this bit is, do you see in your research any strong conflict between novel and, you know, web novel writers with traditional print writers in China?
Yeah,
it's like, you know, the strong resistance or.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually evolving. If you look at the discourses probably 10 years ago in the mainstream media in China, usually there were criticisms over web novels. So how bad quality it is, how, you know, unsuitable content they have. And gradually, I mean, that's mostly the criticism from the traditional sector. And nowadays, I mean, gradually, the comments are more positive, and that is evolving the attitudes. And also, the more professional writers now joined online writing because they saw the great potential commercial potential, cultural influence. But there is some kind of conflict. I think probably one is the blurring, evolving boundary between popular literature and the literary fiction in China. So because in the pre-digital age, there was debate on, so what is good, which is good, the popular literature or the pure literature. So that debate also in some ways extended to the digital publishing system in relation to web novels. So definitely some people like it, some people hate it. So that happens to all the literary fields. I think in China, it's not really an exception.
Very good. I have a few questions. If anyone has more questions, please feel free to put in the Q&A. And Ke asked this question, and I think you have touched on it, but if you would like to expand, can web novels become a successful case of Chinese foreign culture export?
Yeah, I think in terms of cultural export, I would believe that web novels definitely has the potential to be something similar to Japanese manga or the Korean drama, TV dramas, because they are actually telling very transcultural stories. It's not just about Chinese stories, which usually suffer from lost in translation problem or, kind of very hard for the foreign audiences to understand. So it has such potential, but also depends on the operation and practices of the web novel companies, whether they are very capable of developing international markets and also the reader side. So I mentioned the 3% rule of English literature translation. It's not just because of publishers, it's more because of the readers. So whether readers really, the mainstream readership is really willing to read more translated foreign literature would be another factor.
And the Ke has a following question. Do you think, I think while listening to your talk about the genres, what type of novels or themes, question is, are these web novels considered as a product of a patriarchal society, like a more macho society?
Yeah, it's probably, it's actually not the real world. From the dark text mining, you could find that why, if you think about it, you are a writer or a translator. In the synopsis or the description, you use a lot of terms like real world or another world or new world, which means that you were talking about a story mostly in the imagined world or in a fantasy world. So that's actually is something I think more popular in the web novel storytelling. But in China, of course, if you look at romance, probably you can find it happening in the mature context or some very trendy words. If you go back to the word cloud, I think also I pay attention to something like a CEO, like a doctor, appearing in the titles of romance titles. So that actually suggests probably some very interesting, that is the dream of professions in the romance storytelling. So it depends on the genres actually. So some may be totally imagined, some probably more realistic.
Jocelyn has a question. How about web publishing of nonfiction?
Well, yeah, that's quite a good question. Actually, because of the commercial success of web novels, there are many experiences of the same model in nonfiction or the other types of publishing. So in China, the web novels are mostly based on an internet giant called Tencent, and another giant, Baidu, is trying to develop nonfiction for years. But the things actually turns to be very different because it might not appear as a long form of books, but very much in competition with news. and journalism. So in China, they call it a self-media or we media. So that's kind of, nonfiction, digital publishing is very much targeting the journalism field rather than fiction. So, and the fiction books still not a very mainstream in the digital publishing field. So that's still probably readers value the reputation of the publisher or writer more. So that's my observation.
Next, a question from Michelle. Michelle asks you, thank you for a great presentation. Do you have a sense of whether these web novels have an impact in schools and university? That is, do they have a presence in curriculum?
Oh, that's good. That's a really good question. Yeah, yeah. Because I'm not selling my own publication, but years ago I wrote a conference paper that is about open publishing and educational innovation, where I mentioned actually the uses of web novels for teaching creative writing, and I think there are kind of initiatives. And if you look at the web novel platform like a WordPad, many teachers actually use it for creative writing teaching, and especially useful for engaging teenager students, because that kind of teaching or the pedagogy would really create a very engaging writing environment. You got some people to interact with your writing. So that is different from traditional teaching. So of course, they have a role in schools, and yeah, in curriculum, and still, in my previous paper, I argue that it heavily depends on the institutional factors, whether we have open-minded principles, for example, because that also involves some ethical issues as well and risks as well. So that's kind of very complex to manage. But I believe it's a very good option. And I remember I used the term catalyst for educational innovation. So there are much potential there.
Next, a question from Jack. I had a book. I had a look at audiobooks on Qingqing FM, and it seems like there are more traditional and classic stories. Do you think then the audiences are different? As you said, web novels are more diverse, so could offer something which mainstream audiobooks can't?
Yeah, audiobooks are really another very interesting and also dynamic field of new publishing practices. And I think worldwide, audiobooks is the fastest growing area in the digital publishing. So it's also give a lot of hope for the publishing industry. And the content, really varies widely. I know that web novels are being created into audiobooks as well. This is very popular as well. And also, of course, there are many classic stories. That depends on different audiences. Web novel stories probably the readers would like to read because that's very addictive in some ways. When you started a long story, you need to know what happened to the characters next. And in the global readership, you probably we found that some international readers, they couldn't wait for translation. So they use Google Translator to translate a Chinese web page in order to know what happened next. So that's actually a way, you can imagine the different reading behavior. So they want to know what happened next. And what audiobooks actually give people a way to enjoy the story, maybe more, in a quietly sitting in somewhere or in commuting in the public transport. So different uses.
Yeah, I have two more questions, and one is, as you mentioned, one of the popular theme is Eastern fantasy, and clearly there are Eastern fantasy. Clearly, it's a culture specific, So Do you find like Eastern fantasy? Is there any reflection of contemporary life, the contemporary society, whether Korea or China, or is it purely fantasy world, has nothing to do with contemporary world?
Yeah, I mean, it's also
like a China society.
Yeah, it's also changing and evolving. I mean, previously, web novels were almost, fantasy novels. And because China, as I mentioned, in Asia as well, there are millions of writers, and they want to differentiate themselves from each other, and also the kind of reading demands. So there are more and more titles about contemporary China, or what they call the realistic stories. And that's actually raises another very big issue. It's really about whether these stories really just are created for fun, or for a romance, a love story as previously popular literature, or as the writers have more freedom and autonomy, so less restriction from publishers or from the censorship in some ways, and will they create something really different? Well, I think that the answer is yes, and there are some kind of more complex issues raised in the web novel stories. For example, the moral standard in the web novel stories probably is different from the published works, and also some kind of the supernatural elements into the real world setting. So that actually behind that is actually the kind of social imagination or the social negotiation of meanings, etc. So that's more complex interplay in the realistic world stories. And that is also something sensitive in China, because if you write a fantasy story, it's safe. And if you write a realistic story, you are facing some kind of a dilemma. Either you please the readers, well, you probably will touch some right line. So that's another factor.
Yeah, that's where my question leading to. Do you find anything political, even a small percentage, or highly allegorical, not necessarily just covered in fantasy story, but it's actually very political. Do you find any of that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's actually again, it's a 20 years evolution, and there are some titles who are actually very political, and also very bold, touching the very sensitive issues, because the authors can publish it online without any restriction, and previously at least. But what happened to these titles were that they are not available today. So they just got deleted. Yeah, they disappeared. So there are actually, indeed, many writers have tried this, and there are some kind of very good stories, but they couldn't last very long, or became the kind of long-standing work. Another trend is actually many writers, they express their political willingness or political ideas in the entertaining storytelling. So not just very explicitly say they want something, but they actually embedded into the storytelling. It's especially true in fantasy, because fantasy in many ways are the kind of young people. They're talking about not just the imagined world, but they are actually showing the identity, concerns, and their opinions on the social issues. So that's actually a very good way actually to negotiate the kind of political opinions. So you think about the storytelling. I mean, there are many fantasy novels. If you look deeply into the content, yeah, probably I wouldn't name them in case that they would be deleted or something like that. But there are some stories really you can explore that issues.
As you mentioned, those are story writing, and they must be, obviously they attract audiences, so they are very good at creating plots and addictive, as you say, they are addicted. So there are some elements or ingredients, or the line a composition, all sorts, so they get it right. So to get people's mind, so people keep reading it, and as you mentioned, some people can't even wait, and so they could go to Google to get some gist of it. Do you think that will be or can be replaced or created by AI?
Yeah, I mean, that's the trend. Yeah, I mean, so for the creation part, many years ago, there were software sold in Taobao about the AI software that help the authors to create a kind of a story or save them some time by putting different kind of elements. For example, if you want to write something about a beautiful character, and you can find a database, they provide you a lot of sentences to do that. So that is in the creation part. And in the translation part, I think there are especially a strong need for that. And because currently the bottleneck is translation. You like it or not, I mean, the fan translation is very useful in starting the whole global expansion, but not really enough for industrialization of global web novels. So you could find, there's a two ways to do that. One is to find professional translators, but actually it's very time consuming given many titles are 2 million words long. And another way is to build an AI agent to do that. I mean, some companies are doing such business. Currently, they are not, I mean, they haven't done a better job than fan translation generally. Though they said they can develop a very powerful algorithm to do this. But novels are novels. And it's even less capable fan translator. It's a human telling a story, and so
I suppose so. Even though there are patterns, still each story is different. One last one, we will let you go. Have you read, how many web novels have you read? Are you addicted?
Well, that's a very good question. Actually, that's my practice is actually. I'm trying to keep myself a little bit away from the addiction. So otherwise, because more define myself as a researcher. So this is my practice is usually I would find a very efficient way to get the story or the key ideas, so sometimes using machine data mining, sometimes to read the kind of very brief introduction. But a couple of best-selling titles I have read, not the whole story, but really to experience the whole writing, which I found really interesting and enjoyable. So, but not every web novel has high-level writing, but some definitely are very enjoyable to read.
Well, you have a good excuse to say, tell your son, I'm busy, I'm doing my research. Actually, you're reading a novel. So,
yeah, that's a good research activity.
Yes, I have a last comment before we finish from David. At my house, my wife and daughter have just finished watching a couple of very popular Chinese miniseries, end to end, full on. One called in English, In the Name of a Family, and the other, Silent Truth. Okay, so because of COVID, I've found myself watching movies streamed. All of us at home found it difficult to watch pre-COVID movies. I think that is because we tend to read narratives that resonate with our current situation. And indeed, our reality has changed so rapidly that we found not much relevance unless we found stories that touch on our reality 2020. That could be more than people wearing masks and touch on the rise of autocratic nationalistic politics in 1930s. I don't know whether you can comment on that. That's a very big question, David.
Yeah, that's a quite
web novels.
Well, that's quite an interesting observation. Yes, it is a big issue. I mean, But I could probably tell you that, you know, in many web novel platforms, you find a kind of COVID-related stories. So they responded to this very quickly, but not really influential, probably because, you know, so it's not the end of the whole pandemic, but also the writers still are trying to find an angle to address that. Yeah, but that actually raises the question of how you can respond to that. And also in a Chinese website, they organize some kind of writing competition related to COVID.
Yeah, I would say probably becoming more popular because of fantasy type. I mean, sometimes you do feel like you're living in a surreal world, you know, so COVID-19 brings a lot of things that are unthinkable before. So it's just really, sometimes you do wonder, are we living in fantasy world? Is that real? So probably there'll be more interesting web novels to come out. So yeah, I mean, it's a great presentation and such a lively discussion. We really have more questions, but yeah, thank you so much. And it's really great, very good seminar we have. And also thank you all audience and for watching this. And we will make it the video available on our website. So I'm sure there will be more people who would like to listen and watch in this seminar. Thank you so much and have a good evening. Bye.